tarde e bem-vindos. Good evening and welcome. My name is Eduardo Waddington. I am director and board member of BRATECC, Brazilian Texas Chamber of Commerce, and also the head of corporate and investment banking at Bradesco, New York. On behalf of the organizer BRATECC, I welcome you all to this seminar titled Macroeconomics and Negotiation Environment between Brazil and the US under the Biden administration. BRATECC is a chamber of commerce devoted to fostering business, networking, and friendship among American and Brazilian companies in a variety of ways, such as conferences, networking, seminars, missions, and events, and webinar learning sessions such as this one. BRATECC supports Brazilian companies doing business in the US using Texas as the gate of entry to the US market. We also support US companies interested in doing business in Brazil. Our chamber is traditionally focused on oil and gas, but also supports companies in the agribusiness and infrastructure sectors, promotes activities with import and export ties with Brazil, as well as other areas that we deem as strategic and will fit with our charter. It's also important to point out that BRATECC is celebrating in 2021 its 20th anniversary, and we are very proud of this achievement. We have internally a few different actions and are promoting several events in August under this new milestone. Regarding today's webinar topic, Brazilian economy has been proving to be more resilient and picking up quickly from the adverse effects of the pandemic. The reason lies on many factors, including a favorable international scenario with global commodities being pressured, plenty of international credit and creation of formal jobs. However, the continuity of this process is challenging, given its strong dependence on not only a sound macroeconomics and fiscal situation that needs to be driven by the reforms, but also on the electoral process happening next year. This political agenda will certainly influence the legislative agenda, affecting the capacity to move ahead on the reforms. On the electoral front, odds of a third wing candidate are reducing, and most likely we will see a polarized process with President Bolsonaro on one side and ex-President Lula on the other. With this background, business environment on both directions, to and from Brazil, will also be affected by the US political, economic, and environmental agendas, considering effects of the tapering of the fiscal stimulus, drought in the West, and the deforestation discussions involving Brazil. With that, I have here two very distinguished speakers on this topic, Fernando Honorato and Silvio Cascione, to discuss with you. But first, before reading their bios, I want to encourage you to submit questions on the Q&A session of the webinar after the speakers give their word on the specific tool available on the screen. Feel free to identify yourself or just do it anonymously. Now let me start by giving you a quick background on Fernando Honorato. Fernando is currently Chief Economist and Director of Research and Economic Studies, Department of Bradesco. He is also coordinator of the Macroeconomic Advisory Group of AMBIMA. He's a member of FUNSEC's Senior Economics Board. He's a guest member of the G100 and and of the chief economist community of the World Economic Forum. During his 18 years in the Bradesco organization, he has held several positions. He was executive superintendent and chief economist, as well as responsible for the credit and stock research areas of Bradesco Asset Management from 2011 to 2016. Deputy chief economist at the bank's economics department from 2008 to 2011. Chief economist at Bradesco BBI from 2007 to 2008, and senior economist at Bradesco from 2003 to 2007. He has 20 years of experience in economic analysis and has articles published in magazines, newspapers, books in Brazil and abroad. As well as his experience with Bradesco, he also worked at the BVA, Bank Boston, and Rosenberg and Associados. Fernando Honorato has a master's and a degree in economics from University of São Paulo, USP, and PhD in management by IESE. His academic work focuses on the Brazilian foreign sector and macroeconomic policies from the Real Plan. He is a regular participant in events organized by the Central Bank, Ministry of Finance, National Treasury, IMF, and World Economic Forum. Now, Silvio's bio. Silvio Cascione is based in São Paulo. Silvio manages Eurasia Group's research in Brazil. Prior to joining Eurasia Group in 2017 as a senior analyst in Brasilia, Silvio worked as a senior correspondent for Reuters News, where he also led economic analysis for Latin America. Silvio holds a master's degree in political science from University of Brasilia, where he conducted research on legislative member organizations. He also has a specialization degree in financial economics from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo, and a bachelor's degree in journalism from University of São Paulo, which he included 1 year of study in Complutense University in Madrid, Spain. Silvio is a native Portuguese speaker and fluent in English and Spanish. I wanted to thank you both for your participation here. And with no further ado, I will hand it over to Fernando to make his presentation. Fernando, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you, Silvio. I hope you all are hearing me fine. So I'd like to thank the Brazilian Texas Chamber of Commerce. It's indeed a pleasure having this moment with you for this evening here in Brazil, for afternoon in US. So I'll be very quick on my quick initial introduction. So I'll be talking about 10-15 minutes at most, and then I'll hand it over to Eduardo and Silvio so we can have plenty of time for the Q&A session. So I will share with you some charts. So is to try to show you some of the reasons why we believe economic growth in Brazil has picked up. Why are we confident in some of these areas, which are opportunities here, and then finally discuss a little bit about the risks, and I'm sure Silvio will share some of his insights on the political area much better than I could do at this time. So very quickly here, well, the economy is performing quite well at the current moment. So perspectives about Brazil have changed quite dramatically since the second half of last year, mostly on the back of a very sound global economic background. So when I look, for example, what's going on in commodity prices globally, you can clearly see that the Brazilian economic cycle is tightly linked to what happens in the global commodity cycle. And this has a lot to do with what goes on in US. Despite almost 50% of Brazilian exports today are directed to China, roughly speaking, between 15 and 20% still are driven to the US, and US economic growth is driving commodity prices higher, and these commodity prices will certainly help. It's already helping, but it will further help the Brazilian economy moving forward. Not only this is an important push toward the global Brazilian macro and aggregate indicators, but look, for example, at specific indicators related to the agricultural sector. So the available income for the agriculture and cattle sector in Brazil, this available income has increased by a lot. I would say, roughly speaking, that expansion in income is by now roughly 60-50% above the previous pandemic level. So this is there are lots of opportunities arising right now in these sectors in Brazil that are mostly linked to commodities, but mostly agriculture and livestock and cattle. Obviously, this is spilling over to the broader economy, not only linked to the commodity sector. Obviously, mining is also a very important part of this discussion. Well, moving forward, the most important area being benefited by these commodity prices are exports. So after a decade of stagnant exports, I would say even dropping exports, this year Brazil will set a record high on its broader exports. And this also means a lot to recovering some capital flows. This means a lot in terms of the dynamics of the economy. When linking that to the US, part of these exports are certainly directed to the United States, as I mentioned before, mostly airplanes with Brazilian company Embraer, who export a lot of these to the US economy. But these, I think we are at the very beginning of a long cycle of a high demand. Think of Biden's plan, for example, just to say for a moment, think about Biden's plan, the $6 trillion plan, being pushed in Congress towards infrastructure. That will certainly mobilize a lot of factors and resources in the commodity area that Brazil can produce and can supply to the global economy. So Brazilian exports will benefit a lot from that. And I think this is the most important input coming from abroad. The second input comes, well, finally, just a final shot on this. A very important aspect about this, or a very important outcome of these rise in exports, is that the current account deficit will drop to a low of zero, roughly speaking, zero, or it could be even a surplus of 0.5% by this year. And this is changing dramatically the risk perception about Brazil. When you think about portfolio investors or even real economy investors, understand that Brazil is not facing any type of balance of payments problem anymore. And this also comprises this lower risk scenario. Well, moving forward, another very important part of the story about the resilience in Brazil relates to credit. So companies in Brazil are having the balance sheet of most Brazilian companies improved a lot during the pandemic. The Brazilian government just released a lot of programs. So typically it's very similar from what happened in the United States. So, but we saw lots of programs that helped companies to clean up their balance sheets, and we are facing the lowest level of indebtedness in a decade. That has a very interesting parallel if I look at families too. But anyway, focusing on companies here, I can make sure that we are at a very beginning of an important credit cycle in coming years in Brazil. So the leverage of companies, the high liquidity globally, and also opportunities arising from commodity sectors and also infrastructure will certainly help the next steps of growth. It not only comes from banking credit, but also from the capital markets. You can see that the capital markets in Brazil are booming at this moment. Not only the equity environment, but also debt environment. So we see a lot of companies issuing debt and equity at this moment to finance not only the rollover of previous more expensive debt, but also to finance other types of investments. Companies at the current moment, they are hoarding some cash to think about opportunities as soon as the economy reopens from the COVID story. So credit will be also a key driver of growth moving forward. On the next step, now I think this is critical to think about Brazil in coming months, is a job creation. So lots of people and investors complain at me and ask, well, what will be a source of growth about Brazil for the next few quarters if the government will not support with their program that as much as they supported up until, let's say, the current quarter. So labor income will be the key driver of growth moving forward. So we have this impulse coming from the global environment. We have low levels of indebtedness and the credit cycle moving forward. And then job creation will be at the heart of the renaissance of the Brazilian growth from the second half of this year up until the end of next year. This is happening across the country. So in every region, in every sector, this is improving quite a lot and helping the recovery as we see up until now. And finally, this is also translating into better revenues and better tax collection for the government. So the formal sector in the economy is behaving in a much better way than before. Let me just give one step back here on the job market because it's also important. Lots of concerns, a lot of complaints about how the country is dealing with the pandemic. So truth to be told, we've been lagging behind on vaccination. We've been lagging behind lots of contracts with vaccine companies. But after a very difficult and tough initial moment, I can assure you now that vaccination rollout is being quite decent. And we estimate that 100% of Brazilians will receive, of the adult population, will receive their first shot by the end of September. And 100% of Brazilians will receive their second shot by the end of October, by the end of November, the end of October and the end of November. These are our estimates. And the reopening of the economy will be quite decent as so. So going back here, my point is we have this engine is being reignited, and this is helping government tax collection. And this is at the heart of a very important transformation in risk perception about Brazil. Look at Brazilian debt, for example, Brazilian government debt. If on one hand, core companies have been able to reduce the level of their indebtedness, that was because on the other side, the government was supporting with public money with their own programs. So as a result, public debt increased a lot during 2020, and markets were very anxious about that increase in debt. But if you look right now, because of the excess growth in revenues, because of the increase in the size of the economy, we see much lower levels of government debt. And when compared to the size of debt we were forecasting by the end of last year to 21 and 22, roughly speaking at 96% of GDP, that is right now 13 percentage points below those levels. This is meaningful to think about risk. And I'll stop here with a final couple of charts. So this improved growth outlook, we think it will it will further influence the compression of Brazilian risk moving forward. And mostly I'm talking about the currency. So when we think about the Brazilian currency, the Brazilian real has decoupled from the average of other emerging markets. And a huge part of this decoupling was related to the way we managed the pandemic at the very beginning with lots of problems, and due to the fiscal uncertainty surrounding the environment I just mentioned about the public debt. Right now, with the rollout of the vaccination moving much faster, with fiscal indicators proving to be much better than what we expected, the exchange rate is appreciating, and we expect it to appreciate further. Maybe it will not reach 410, as you see on our screen, close to the emerging market levels, but we assume this could strengthen further, maybe to 4.7, 4.5 reais per dollar. And this will also further strengthen some investments, some foreign investments towards Brazil. Obviously, this high level of devaluation of the currency produced a lot of inflation in Brazil. That also is happening in the US. A huge part of this inflation is transitory, owing to the devaluation of the currency and some the hike in commodity prices. But we see these effects abating in tandem with the central bank start hiking. They already hiked a lot, from 2% to 4.25% on the benchmark interest rate. We forecast them to reach 6.5 by the end of this year, although markets are pricing in much more hikes than what we think are necessary. But by the end of the day, we'll have a much more, I would say, equilibrated economy, in the sense that we have high rates, lower inflation, a more appreciated exchange rate, and higher growth. As a result, we see the economy growing more than 5% this year, maybe 2.2% next year, because we are I would say, cautious about the election process, as Silvio will certainly talk a little bit about further. But if I take a look more broadly, and if the fiscal rules are kept throughout the election of 2022 and beyond 2023, I would be very constructive in a lot of sectors in Brazil, specifically the commodity sector, the manufacturing and exporting sector, and also infrastructure. And I think these have huge linkage with the US economy. So I'll stop here and hand it over to Eduardo so he can turn to Silvio, and then we have a lot of time for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fernando. Very nice insights. And now I'm going to hand it over to Silvio for his presentation. Silvio, please.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. First of all, I'd like to thank the Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity to discuss the political outlook here with you. Also thank Fernando for this very good presentation. And it helps me a lot because the real key to understand Brazil's political scenario for this year and especially for next year with the elections is the economy. Okay, we have a scandal escalating in Brasilia. All the newspapers, the headlines are now mentioning the corruption allegations, and everyone is following these news very closely. And of course, they can have an impact, and we can discuss this a little bit. But much more important than the scandals in Brasilia is the economic dynamics going after COVID-19, how the economy will recover after this pandemic, and if that economic recovery will be sustained. We think that will be the most important variable to determine the risk premium, the political risk through the rest of this year, and most importantly, the election outlook next year. But first of all, let me take a step back and try to explain why we have such a view and how the scenario can change going forward. The most important factor driving political risk in Brazil and in every country over the past 16 months has been the pandemic. So up until the pandemic, we had Brazil standing out in Latin America with an aggressive reformist cycle. Of course, Brazil wasn't approving all the reforms that it needs to really jumpstart economic growth very quickly. But if you compare Brazil to other emerging economies, Brazil was moving forward with economic reforms to strengthen fiscal policy, to boost productivity, to open a lot of regulated sectors to private investments. And when the pandemic hit, then uncertainty grew a lot. You had the economy grinding to a halt, everyone needing to stay home, and that dealt a very huge blow to the economy, as Fernando just showed us with these indicators. And a lot of the fiscal risk that drove asset prices in Brazil and weakened the currency for a good part of that period came from the uncertainty related to the pandemic. So, of course, we are not out of the woods yet, but we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel. The vaccination rollout, as Fernando laid out, is moving faster, and Brazil is not far behind its peers. Actually, Brazil is ahead of most emerging economies. It's not lagging far behind other developed economies. By the end of September, all the adults in Brazil have received their first shot. We agree with that assessment. So what we have right now is much less fiscal risk, because at the end of the day, despite all these noise, the administration and Congress, they managed to keep fiscal risks contained. There was a lot of extra cap spending outside the constitutional cap last year. But for this year, the amount of extraordinary government spending was much smaller. And there are little doubts now that about the government's capacity to keep spending under the constitutional ceiling for this year and next. And that assessment, the assessment that Bolsonaro and Congress will comply with the fiscal rules until the election, is helping reduce the level of political risk in Brazil, and is helping drive asset prices, help strengthen Brazilian asset prices over the past couple of months. And assuming these fiscal risk won't grow in coming months because the pandemic is gradually getting behind us, then this environment is probably sustained from the fiscal point of view. Okay, but one of the things that we learned going through the pandemic, and as the government came under a lot of pressure to respond to this crisis, was that the government's, the president's popularity is quite resilient. We have a very polarized political environment in Brazil, which resembles a lot the political environment of the United States prior to during the Trump administration. And despite all the pressure from the opposition and the increase in Bolsonaro's rejection rates, especially during the latest second wave of the pandemic between February and April, despite that, his numbers have stabilized at roughly 30% of the population approving of his administration. So that's quite significant, because that tells us that Bolsonaro's support base is quite loyal, and the bar for any other events to undermine his popularity is also quite high. It's not any corruption scandal about his son, about his allies, that will cut his approval ratings. And that has a lot of repercussions for the scenario going forward, which is what I'm here to talk about. So one of the things that this tells us is that for the second half of this year, the legislative agenda still has room to move forward. Brazil's Congress just approved the privatization of Eletrobras, and if the president retains a reasonable level of popularity, even facing corruption allegations and the repercussions from the pandemic, then he's able to retain some degree of support in the lower house and the Senate to approve reform. So the privatization of Eletrobras was the last one, and tax reform is probably the next one in the pipeline. And tax reform has a lot of electoral appeal. So we are seeing a 65% probability of this recent proposal of an income tax reform being approved in Congress this year. A proposal which would reduce the baseline corporate tax rate in Brazil, but on the other hand, introduce taxation on dividends. We can talk more about that in the Q&A session. We think the government, the administration will be able to approve it this year. And other regulatory measures have some room to advance. Of course, the window for reform is closing, but it's still there in the second half of this year. And then the other repercussion for next year is about the elections. With such a resilient base of support, even though there could be some temporary drop in his approval ratings, with the economy recovering and at the speed that Fernando showed us, especially for this year, with such a quick recovery of the economy in 2021, then there's the potential for Bolsonaro's approval rating to recover somewhat, just a few points. But even that would still be enough for Bolsonaro to go through a runoff vote. And if you think that on the other side of the aisle, you have former President Lula with also a very solid base of support, then you see that there's little room for a third way candidate to emerge as a competitive alternative to both Bolsonaro and Lula. Of course, these recent corruption scandals have been encouraging some potential candidates to throw their names and maybe think that Bolsonaro may collapse and they may have a shot at next year's election, but the election is 15 months away. And we think that the economic recovery will actually be a more important factor and will keep this room for a third way candidate very limited. And a final word, just to I don't want to take too long in my introductory remarks, but just to conclude with a point on another subject, but which is also very important for Brazil, not only before the elections, but also after the elections. At the international stage, the stakes for Brazil are increasingly high when it comes to the climate change discussions And this administration is trying to improve its standing in international negotiations, just replaced its environment minister, Ricardo Salles, and saying that came as a bid to burnish Brazil's credentials, try to bring a new face to the table and try to gain more leverage in negotiations about carbon credit mechanisms, and also bilateral talks with the United States about efforts to curb deforestation. Well, we think all of that will depend on the actual deforestation rates, even though the government is making an effort to mitigate the damage for the Brazilian economy, for Brazil as a whole, from that international pressure, and is trying to curb deforestation and show some results. We think that the risks for Brazil remain high depending on the next dry season. And the numbers here are still mixed. So we had numbers late last year pointing to a reduction in deforestation this year, but more recent numbers are pointing to the contrary. So the verdict is still open in our view. But if Brazil manages to reduce deforestation rates this year, then the door is open for a deal with the US. This interest in the US, at least in our perception, for a deal with Brazil, and that could also strengthen both Brazil's and the US's position ahead of COP26, when all the countries will try to take another step forward in the Paris Agreement regulations with the Article 6 rules. So I'll stop here and then hand it over back to Eduardo and go to the Q&A session to go into more detail in some of the subjects I just laid out. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Silvio. Very interesting to hear the mood that is happening out there in Brasilia. We're not going to begin the Q&A session. Participants can submit questions anonymously or identifying themselves using the Q&A button on your screen. Let me start by asking a question to Fernando, which I myself, and I know many of the participants as well, are interested. We're hearing a lot about comments about a possible energy shortage in Brazil, either in 2021 or 2022. How do you currently assess this situation, Fernando? And then Silvio, you're welcome to give your comments, please.
No, perfect, Eduardo. Thank you very much for the question. And that also links to what Silvio just ended with his speech about the drought on parts of Brazil. These phenomena are linked. So to an extent, the risks emerging from some fire on the Amazon forest is also linked to what's happening with the reservoirs, the water reservoirs linked to water. Well, having said that, my point is, I'd like to stress two periods here. One is, we are certainly going through a stress moment. Our calculations show that the levels of reservoirs could be as low as 10% by the end of the drought, the dry season, so right before the rainy season. This puts some risk of energy shortage by the end of 2021, but our baseline is that we will escape this situation because the government just start managing some of their tools to redirect water, to try to reduce consumption, and also a lot of price increases in energy tariffs, so consumers can reduce the amount of energy they consume. So what is striking is that this is becoming frequent in Brazil in the last 10 years. So we've been each and every year saying, whoa, this is the worst rainy season in 90 years. This is the worst rainy season in 80 years. So it's becoming more and more frequent. And this is certainly linked to what Silvio mentioned about environment issues in Brazil. Having said that, I think energy is one of the areas in which we see most opportunity in Brazil for the next 10, 15 years. This is an area in which Brazil not only holds a lot of expertise in terms of clean energy, not only on the hydropower, but also on wind power. And we can certainly help develop our energy grid, the whole power grid, very successful in coming years with foreign investors. So I believe there will be massive investment in energy in the next 10, 15 years in Brazil. And certainly this is an area of huge opportunities. So all in all, my point is I have a sort of mixed feeling. For the very short term, we see some risks, although this is not the baseline. And depending on the rainy season, it's unfortunately impossible to forecast anything for the rainy season at the current moment. But depending on the rainy season, this risk could be higher or lower by 2022, and this would certainly have some effect on the election process. I believe, at least that's my view. I would love to hear Silvio's assessment. But so for the very short term, this is a risk story, but don't get too much concerned because our calculations show, well, we will survive this moment. Medium term, I think this is an area of huge opportunity in Brazil for investors that would like to link their investments to clean energy, sustainable energy, and also helping developing the Brazilian economy, that if after the election it starts growing faster than in the last decade, what I assume will happen if the election unfolds with a favorable macroeconomic and sound macroeconomic policies, I think energy will be a key driver of growth in Brazil in the next couple of decades.
Yeah, and I can briefly add to your comments with two remarks about the risks and the opportunities. Here on the political side, and agreeing with your assessment that we don't have an energy crisis as a base case. So you're talking more about tariff hikes than about energy cuts and blackouts. But this is a tail risk for the election. So if we are wrong about that, and because it doesn't rain, or because there are some disruptions in Brazil's electricity system, this could be more of a game changer to the election outlook by undermining Bolsonaro's popularity to a larger extent, and then not only making Lula potentially the favorite to win the election, but also opening some room for a third-way candidate to emerge as a competitive name. So it's not only about what's going to happen at the end of this dry season this year, but how the next rainy season will be and how that will affect the election outlook next year. But the opportunity is also clear to us, as you mentioned. And here I would just highlight the natural gas sector, because all of these concerns about Brazil's electricity system is increasing very quickly political support for natural gas as an alternative, a cleaner alternative than fuel-based thermal plants, to serve as a backup capacity to reduce Brazil's reliance on hydroelectricity generation. So you can see the administration, it was already passing legislation to attract more private investments to natural gas in Brazil. It already had Petrobras selling assets and opening room for other players to come in and invest in Brazil's natural gas infrastructure. And now the administration is actively engaging to even purchase natural gas capacity. There's a lot of controversy about the way it is doing so. But the bottom line here is that there's political support for natural gas in Brazil. And part of that is driven by the lack of confidence in hydroelectricity generation.
Eduardo, if you allow me a very quick comment here, exactly on the point that Silvio just mentioned, because some of you that are not familiar with the Brazilian power sector might think that, well, there's a risk of energy shortage because of lack of investments. That was not the case. The reason was because of lack of diversity on the power sector, exactly because of the lack of rain. So Silvio was precise on his point. So we expect a lot of diversification, and obviously because of the clean demand and clean requirements, this will certainly drive investments in wind power and natural gas. Because again, if you look at total potential for generating energy in Brazil, it's roughly speaking 1.5 times the total demand, between 1.5 to 2 times total demand of energy. But the thing is, if it's not raining, the capacity to generate power, so installed capacity is much higher potentially than the total demand. But in fact, because of the lack of the rain, it's not delivering the amount of energy. So diversification is the word here.
Okay, thanks. Speaking of energy and sectors that may represent alternatives and opportunities for investments, I have a question here from my friend Antonio Planos. Do you see increasing value add evolution and political will beyond commodities for the Brazilian economy in the next 10 years, irrespective of political outcome? For instance, think about Embraer evolving from airplanes to space transport manufacturer. What other sectors, categories could Brazil leverage?
Oh, Silvio, maybe I'll start here. So the way I like to think about that, Eduardo, is, and thank you, Antonio, for your question. So the way an economy can decouple from the commodity cycle, the way Brazil is linked for the last 40 years, is to be more productive. And how can Brazil become more productive? And that links a lot with the subjects Silvio just mentioned during his speech. So one key aspect is the tax reform, or let me put another way, the tax code is key to understand why Brazil lacks some productivity in lots of sectors in Brazil, and why taxes are so high and the tax code is so complex. Part of that is because of the size of government expenditures, because we've been spending a lot for the last 40 years. The total amount of taxation needs to be high to compensate for those high levels of expenditure, and as a result, we see higher taxes. So this problem is being started to be addressed with the former administration, with Temer back in 2016 with the spending cap, and this is key to understand why I'm positively constructive about Brazil moving forward. We are starting to see, and Silvio mentioned some of these reforms during his speech, we are starting to see the positive benefits. We are starting to collect some benefits of the previous reforms. I can mention some of them: the spending cap, labor reform. Look at what's happening right now in the formal job market in Brazil. It's impressive. It's the first time we get rid of a crisis with the formal market performing much better than the non-formal market. And this is, on my view, on the back of Temer's labor reform. So a spending cap, labor reform, pension reform. Now we have an independent central bank, water and sewage reform. So all these reform will create a lot of room for Brazil to develop new sectors and strengthen sectors that go much beyond the commodity cycle. And I fully agree with Antonio's question, in the sense that irrespective of the election, obviously, we cannot elect someone that is not committed to a minimal macro arrangement of fiscal adjustment and a minimal arrangement of sound macro policy. If that's not the case, so if you elect someone committed to these sound policies, I think that we have 10 years ahead of us to increase per capita income in sectors that we did not see in the last 4 years because of these reforms. Obviously, if Silvio follows me and say that, well, we will approve a sound tax reform, I would be much more constructive. Truth to be told, I'm not that much comfortable with the current tax reform. I think maybe the final design is not the one we were thinking about. But anyway, there are chances, and I'll allow Silvio to speak on his side, there are chances to approve some tax reform, and that would certainly speed up what Antonio's question is about. So just not only decoupling Brazil from the commodity cycle, but improving growth in other sectors. I would mention infrastructure mostly, and include energy, as I already mentioned, manufacturing, exporting sectors, leisure. So there are huge opportunities here if we are able to, after or beyond 2023, have a decent tax reform and some commitment to sound macro policies.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Fernando, that a lot of Brazil's challenges are related to tax reform. And then here, the good news is that in this long reform cycle in Brazil, now it's tax reform time. The bad news is that they are moving on piecemeal. So it's a piecemeal approach that goal to try and approve a very comprehensive constitutional tax reform, which was being endorsed by former House Speaker Rodrigo Maia. Well, that lost momentum. It's very unlikely to happen before the next elections, but still some improvements or some changes are likely to come this year. And the problem about, and speaking about the specific income tax reform bill under negotiation in Congress right now, there are a few problems with that bill, and one of them seems to be, at least listening to the private sector is telling the administration, is that the net impact of this reform is actually not neutral. It translates into a tax hike for most companies. So the administration, lawmakers, they will recalibrate the tax rates. They'll try to find a more balanced outcome that would not represent a tax increase to most companies. But if they manage to do that, and also if they manage to change some of the details of that proposal that have been criticized by different market participants because they add complexity to the Brazil system, or harm specific sectors like real estate, if they manage to find that equilibrium, and the negotiations are ongoing these months, then this reform could have very positive repercussions, because one of the things that the administration is trying to achieve with this reform is to encourage more investments in Brazil and to reward the most profitable and productive companies. Because when you reduce taxation on the companies and increase taxation on dividends, what they do is to create incentives for companies to keep their capital and to reinvest their capital into their most profitable activities instead of transferring dividends to shareholders. So that is the mechanism the administration is pushing to try and increase Brazil's investment levels and productivity across the board. But of course, that objective will only be achieved if the net impact of that reform doesn't bring tax hikes, because otherwise that would defeat the purpose of the bill. We are more constructive about tax reform. We think not only this support for an income tax overhaul, a good one this year, but also there's a chance we expect we have 60% odds of approval for a federal VAT reform. So simplifying PIS and COFINS taxes and creating a federal VAT, that would also be an incremental positive step towards simplifying Brazil's tax system. And also the next president will also probably find a relatively benign environment in Congress to keep discussing tax issues and moving forward with changes in Brazil's tax system to reduce the cost of doing business in Brazil. We are getting less optimistic on the fiscal side, not because we're seeing an increase in public spending. As said, the government is managing to keep spending below the ceiling throughout the election, so the fiscal risks are contained. But the bad news is that we are less optimistic about the structural reforms that would solve one of Brazil's biggest problems, which is the rigidity of public spending. As you said, Fernando, the problem is that Brazil's state is large. Brazil spends a lot, and a lot of Brazil's budget is very rigid. There's no discretionary spending, almost. And for Brazil to reduce the level of mandatory spending, it needs to follow up on pension reform, and it needs to approve an administrative reform. It needs to approve measures that will give more flexibility to manage the public service, to unearmark spending, and the potential for measures like that to be approved before the election is low. We now have 40% odds for administrative reform to pass before the elections, and with Lula emerging as a strong contender in the elections, then the risk for 23 is of an increase in public spending, not a decrease, depending on Lula's platform.
Sorry, again, a very quick comment here. I mentioned a lot about productivity, and this is not in the role of reforms right now, but education is also key to think about perspectives on Brazil. And again, thinking about the private sector, I think there are huge and interesting opportunities to invest in education in Brazil in the next 10, 15 years. I think this area will yield lots of interesting results for the private sector too.
Thanks, guys. One question from also my good friend Pedro Bonesio. This one is for you, Silvio, and then Fernando, you can comment on it. Do you think the environmental issue that the international community perceives will cause any burdens to the ability of Brazil to enjoy and capture the benefit of Brazil's growing export cycle?
Yes, of course. The climate change issue is becoming a top global priority, and Brazil, because of its geographical position, because of all its natural resources, it has the potential to be leading these efforts globally. But it's actually getting a lot of international pressure because it's not delivering on some of its commitments, and especially on the efforts to combat deforestation. Deforestation is the main part of Brazil's Paris Agreement pledges. So Brazil has the commitment to cut carbon emissions and try to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, and reducing deforestation is a key part of that. Brazil has the goal to end illegal deforestation by 2030, but when you look at the actual deforestation rates, they are trending the other way, right? They're rising, and this is a very strong reason why Brazil is getting so much pressure from the international community, not only from states, but also from the investor community and from companies which are worried about the environmental issue. So Brazil can't escape that. Brazil can't hide from that fact. And the longer it takes for Brazil to show results, to show actual results, to combat deforestation, the more pressure Brazil will get. And here we'll be talking not only about missing the opportunities to strike deals with other countries, with companies, by attracting more investments, but we could be talking about trade boycotts, for example, or maybe other types of measures to try and increase pressure on Brazil's administration to do more. We see that the administration is trying to improve its capacity to combat deforestation. This year, they are not only deploying the military in the Amazon, they are also deploying state police forces, and they're trying to engage more closely with local authorities to try and reduce deforestation in the Amazon. But the numbers are not yet encouraging. As I said, we have a mixed picture on the ground, and the president's rhetoric doesn't help. So the costs for Brazil are tangible, and they will only get higher the longer it takes for Brazil to deliver results here.
Just to complement on my side, I fully agree with Silvio. This is a high-stake story. There's no way Brazil will get rid of this and to serve as a country that complies to these environmental rules. What I can tell you from our side, Eduardo, from the private sector, that the private sector is moving very, very fast and quickly in the right direction. So think of companies like Bradesco, but I could mention lots of companies in Brazil. Think of the listed companies at the Brazilian stock market, for example. All of them have very strong ESG programs. They're really highly committed to the Paris Agreement changes and challenges. So I think the private sector, if the government, or whoever is at the government in the coming years, does not understand the importance of this topic, the private sector will not depend on the government. They will do by themselves, and they'll try not to allow this environment issue to be a burden for their businesses, not only because of the business itself, but because it's important as a value for these companies in the private sector in Brazil.
Thanks, Fernando. I have time for one more question, but the answer have to be really quick. And so I'm going to ask you, do you believe that the current economy recovery is more a cyclical or a structural one?
Maybe we would need another 40 minutes. Let me put this way, Eduardo. I think certainly we're facing a cyclical recovery for the short term, for sure. This is the reopening of the vaccination. This is the global environment. This is the commodity cycle, low rates in Brazil, a lot of public expenditure. So this is certainly a cyclical recovery. Having said that, I think investors should not rule out a positive surprise on growth in the next, let's say, 2 to 3 years, on the back of the reforms I mentioned and Silvio mentioned during his speech. So we did a lot of things, truth to be told. There's a lot of noise in Brazil. I know, I understand the noise. Part of the noise is reasonable, part is not reasonable, whatever. The thing is, we reformed a lot. So if we don't face big political hurdles in coming quarters, I would expect the structural part of Brazilian growth to pick up and at least deliver maybe 0.5, 0.6 of more GDP than before, of higher GDP.
Silvio, any comments or?
The comment that I'd make is if we're talking about a longer term horizon, as Fernando mentioned, like 2 to 3 years, Brazil reaping the benefits of the reform cycle. The one thing that I'd add is that even though there's a chance Lula returns in 22 and wins the election, then all the eyes will be on how much he would reverse this reform cycle. And our feeling is that not so much, actually. Of course, there will be more pronounced fiscal risks. Then the government will be talking about increasing spending beyond the constitutional ceiling, and that would drive a lot of concern in markets. That would have an impact, of course, on asset prices. We don't know where the final equilibrium will be, but there will be a discussion about how much spending Brazil, how much spending, extra spending Brazil would be able to afford. But when you look at the regulatory improvements that were made, many of the changes to open up regulated sectors, the privatizations, maybe some of those measures, the administration won't have the appetite to move forward with them, privatizations, for example, but they wouldn't be backtracking on those measures. So that is also a positive development, which reinforces Fernando's assessment that there's the potential for Brazil to reap the benefits of this reform cycle, and maybe economic growth will be surprising on the upside in coming years because of that.
One aspect about privatization, I know we have a hard stop, Eduardo, but the thing is that there are lots of things going on in the states. So sometimes we think about federal investments, and for sure, this is an important part of the story. But again, don't miss the important stories moving on in lots of Brazilian states that are benefiting from these new rules on privatizations. And the governors are really active on delivering investments in infrastructure on the base of privatizations, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, guys, thank you very much, Fernando and Silvio. Thank you both for your answers and great insight. This concludes our Q&A session. And now I'm going to close. I wanted to thank BRATECC for organizing this event. Thank for our sponsors for their great support. And finally, thank the audience and for the participations and questions submitted. And just a quick reminder of our events following now in July. So we're going to have on July 9th an online event, open mic. That's a meet and greet for members only. On July 15th, also online, Downstream, the future of petrochemical industry in Brazil and its relation to supply chain. And then on July 29th, we're going to have our first presential event, BRATECC Summer Business Mixer. This is going to be in Fogo de Chão. So promises of a good event, first one after the pandemic. And also very important to remind that in August, we will have the presential OTC Offshore Technology Conference, and BRATECC will hold 2 events during this week. So stay aware on our website for the networking opportunities. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Very much. Wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye, Silvio.
Bye. Bye, Fernando. Bye, Eduardo.
Bye.